tell a parent that they could ask any question and that they would get an absolutely correct, true answer to it, I bet a lot of they could just pick one. I bet the question that a lot of them would pick would be something like, what can I do so that my kids grow up to be happy and confident? Well, coincidentally, that's the question the next panel are going to answer. Try to answer, perhaps I should say. It'll be moderated by one of Queensland's most experienced broadcasters. She was on ABC TV for many years, most recently has been Channel 9's health reporter. Please welcome to introduce the panel, Lisa Backhouse.
Well, good afternoon everyone, and welcome along to our panel discussion this afternoon on bringing up confident, happy children, as James said. It's a topic that parents everywhere can relate to because, quite simply, I guess we all want what's best for our children. And at the heart of that, after their health and security issues have been met, it's their happiness that we strive for, angst over, and of course are most passionate about. But how do we go about creating an environment for our children that's going to make them happy in the present and confident contributing members of society in the future? Today we're joined by some of the experts in the field, and hopefully they're going to give us some very good direction. As the mother of two young teenagers, I'm looking for some good advice, and I'm sure you are as well. So just introducing our panellists this afternoon to you, we've all met Maggie and Russ from our earlier sessions. And we also have joining us today Eve Ekman. Now, Eve holds a Masters of Social Work from the University of California, Berkeley. She's currently working on her PhD in the School of Social Welfare with an emphasis on clinical empathy. Eve also authored Mothers on the Fast Track, How a New Generation Can Balance Family and Careers. So we look forward to hearing more on that. We're also delighted to have Professor Jake Najman with us today. Jake holds a joint appointment as Director of the Queensland Alcohol and Drug Research and Education Centre at the School of Population Health and also Professor of Sociology in the School of Social Science at the University of Queensland. He's taught and researched in the area of social science and public health for the last 30 years, and he's renowned in the field, so we look forward to hearing from him as well. Would you please make our panellists very welcome? So lots of interesting ground to cover this afternoon, and unfortunately we don't have a lot of time. It's a very broad area. But perhaps we should start by setting the scene and first of all having a look at whether or not our children actually are less confident and less happy than in past generations. Perhaps we could start with Jake. Would you like to begin with that one?
Thank you. I suppose I'd start by emphasising that there's been a lot of research on human happiness. Often it falls under the broad banner of the quality of human life. This research goes back to the 1970s and tends to consistently show that there is one thing above all others that impacts on human happiness, on the quality of human life. And it is so far ahead of any other thing that the others are relatively unimportant. And it's the quality of the relationship, the family relationship in which the person lives. A happy marriage, for better or worse circumstances, turns out to be by far the strongest predictor of human happiness. Now, when we look at the world around us, what we're seeing are a range of changes which impact on marriage and the quality of marriages. We're moving to a world where marriage is less permanent. Something like a third to a half of children will be reared in a home where one or both parents are not their biological parent. And we know from repeated studies that the children who are reared in homes where there is marital conflict or where one or other of their parents is not their biological parent are less happy, have a lower quality of life, and very little compares. And by one quick contrast, if I may, if we look at income, that is the amount of wealth that the family have, the correlation between the happiness of the child and the wealth of the family is in the order of 0.1. The correlation between the marriage and the quality of the marriage that the child lives in, that is the family life, is something in the order of 0.5. And so we're dealing with orders of magnitude that are different. Now, what do we do about a world where the structural changes are such that marriage is becoming less popular, where young people are not getting married, and what's going to happen to their children.
Thanks, Joker. And also, Eve, I guess, mothers are out of the house more and more, working longer and longer hours, as well as husbands are, to make ends meet and so forth. What sort of effects are we seeing from that?
Yeah, so the majority of the research that we did regarding mothers and family formation, what we were interested in was actually what was preventing mothers from possibly achieving what would truly make them happy. What we have hoped for with the women's rights movement over many years. And this is a book I worked on with my mother, and it was a wonderful experience, the difference that she's had and that I have had. I want to highlight something positive, which is women and girls growing up have more opportunities than they've ever had. And this is a very beautiful and wonderful thing. However, this is somewhat overshadowed by the fact that despite being 50% in the professional programs, lawyers, doctors, and other PhD tracks, they still have a very small amount at the highest echelons. So what we're wondering is if the women who are reaching for these high careers are achieving them. And this was the question our book sought to answer. What we found was many women decided they could not balance both. And many women decided to have a career that was maybe not their ideal and instead stay home with their children. Whether or not this is one that is beneficial for children in the long run is not something we addressed. It would be hard to speculate. Is the happiness and the striving of the mother and the father equal to what is able and what is available for their children as a result?
But are our kids less happy and less confident? I mean, I guess that's the issue. In your address, Maggie, you talked about, the violence of Lady Gaga and the like. Yeah. In our generation, we had Kiss vomiting up blood on the stage.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So have the generations really changed that much, I guess, is the question.
One of the things that was really interesting to me and quite saddening was the number of teenagers who said they felt adults didn't care. And I think one of the difficulties for kids now is there's kind of a growing abyss between what our kids are experiencing in their world and how we perceive their world. And I have to say, before I began my research, I didn't know 80 or 90% of what I now know. And I think there is a growing unhappiness with that, because it means that, as they say to me often, Maggie, where do I begin with mum and dad? They talk about the freak out factor. Where do I begin to tell them about my world before I can get to my specific issue? And so that was something that loomed very large when I was talking to the kids, was that sense that they were kind of on one island and we're on another.
So is that something different, or has it always been that way?
Look, I think there's always a difference between generations, of course, but I think with the huge change in everything that's happening on the planet, the technologies, plus the social fragmentation, it means that the nurture that children had previously, I think, is much more tenuous now. I think as adults we're more anxious, and I think, it's things like the news. Kids get very affected about the news about climate, about war, and these kinds of things. It does breed a sense of helplessness, and when you talk to them about the future, a lot of them feel they're inheriting a world with just unbelievable problems. And that is one of the things that is actually fueling the risky behaviour. So I might as well go out and get drunk and have sex and do it all now, kind of while there's a world.
Our children have certainly had to live through, I think, far more than what our generation, certainly my generation, has had to live through. I mean, we certainly grew up with the fear of nuclear war hanging over our head and a nuclear winter. But when I think about the issues that my children have had to face, starting with 9/11 and going all the way through the disasters that we have seen over the past 15 to 20 years, have just been extraordinary.
Yes.
And what sort of effect is that going to have on our kids? Russ, would you like to talk to that?
Well, I mean, obviously all kids grow up with fear and anxiety, and I mean that is a normal part of the childhood experience. We've heard that kids' anxieties are getting greater, but I think that our parents are doing a disservice to our kids by not kind of talking about fear and anxiety and how you deal with it. It's kind of something that's put you know, it's like we're talking, the panel is about confident children and the message at school, self-esteem and confidence. And people aren't kind of talking about the fact that fear and anxiety are normal emotional reactions. And they're not equipping people with the skills to kind of be able to handle that. You know, I wonder how much of the increasing anxiety we're seeing in kids is actually due to, you know, what they're exposed to in the environment. I'm sure that plays a factor. But I also think a factor is we're increasingly in this feel-good society that is obsessed with feeling good. And I'm not allowed to have any kind of unpleasant negative feelings in my body, and kind of this sort of, thank you, thanks Mum, and this kind of, and this kind of struggle, and I have to kind of, you know, that confidence is seen, as I was talking earlier, that is the absence of fear and anxiety. I think that plays a big factor in all of this too.
So how do we equip our children then emotionally for life? Do we need to talk to them more? As you said, do we need to get anxiety out into the open?
I think we do. You know, like if you look at the comics, the heroes and heroines that kids are exposed to in books and comics and movies and TV shows, they are fearless. Your fearless hero, like the only, you know, James Bond, Indiana Jones, Charlie's Angels, Wonder Woman, they have no fear. You know, one James Bond movie once, I saw a droplet of sweat on his forehead. There's Sean Connery in Dr. No, strapped to a table, laser beams about to slice his knackers off. He's allowed to have a droplet of sweat on his forehead, but when the whole world's about to blow up, he just cracks a joke. The only kind of popular hero who admits to being afraid is Harry Potter. Is that because Harry Potter's written by a woman? Just speculating that if Harry Potter had been written by a bloke, then maybe Hermione might have been the scared one. But, you know, we need to start kind of educating kids about their emotions and what's normal and how to deal with them. And the less education I have about my fear and anxiety, the more I'm going to struggle with it and the bigger it will get.
Eve, would you like to pick up on that?
Well, what this brings up, I'm thinking the way in which we can influence these children should be through these new technologies. And I think we discussed that a bit at lunch, is that there's a wide open portal. As many kind of menacing factors exist on Facebook, for some folks there could also be an opportunity when you are in a very small town and maybe you are gay and you have no one to talk with, you can find a whole other source of support. And if there's a way to emphasize the ways to connect people in a positive way, that could really be a boon to what is otherwise quite a dark world that we were shown.
Yeah, we talked about creating a new video game, ultimate altruism. You know, you have to kind of go online and do acts of kindness to everybody, throw yourself under a train to protect the other characters.
A positive video game, wouldn't that be a nice change?
Yeah.
But would the kids want to see that? I don't think they would. I know my two boys would, you know. Would that be interesting for children?
I think if you make it engaging enough, and I mean, in a sense, let's face it, I think that's one of the reasons why Harry Potter is so positive, because it's that very classic hero's journey, you know, the struggle, the good against evil, all those themes, and the kids really got that, and that sense of the other world. And I think absolutely we just have to have really good storytellers. I think also we just got to stop trying to live our children's lives for them, stop trying to be their best friends, allow them to fail, allow them to understand that, you know, sometimes life can be really tough, but actually out of that is often where the magic lies. And I think with things like climate change, we should be saying to children, you know, when Granddad was alive, you know, it was a depression and war, and we've got climate change and a few things like that, but guess what? One day you're going to walk out of the shower or be taking the dog for a walk, and you're going to come up with an idea I can't even dream of. Isn't that magical? Isn't that wonderful? You're going to find solutions to things I will never, never think of. So that we're getting them to look at understanding that life is always going to be about finding solutions, and that they have an active and powerful part to play in it.
Jake, can events in a young child's life accurately predict where they're going?
Well, what we've been doing for the last 30-odd years is we recruited in the early 1980s some 5,000 pregnant women, and we've been following those mothers and their children ever since. And we're just about to look at the children at 30, and the mothers we've just studied close to 30 years of age. And we look at how the health and well-being and happiness and so on of the child changes from birth to adulthood. I think the first thing I want to say in relation to what my colleagues here are saying is that it's surprising how many children who experience significant adversity and trauma turn out to be normal, healthy, happy kids. In fact, the thing that's absolutely amazing is that children who've been sexually abused as children, children who've been beaten, children who've had food and clothing withheld, they've been neglected severely. Most of those children, when they grow up as adults, are indistinguishable in health and well-being from other children. That's not to deny that some of them go on to have serious mental health problems, and that the children who've been exposed to these things are disproportionately likely to have these problems, but that on the whole, the vast majority turn out to be normal, happy, healthy children. And the message that I have is you know, for most children, you've got to really stuff up to make a difference, because most of them seem to turn out well, irrespective of what we as parents do. Having said that, the link between the young child and the adult is relatively weak. That is, children who've got poor mental health at 5 turn out to be on the whole very healthy at 21, and children who have poor mental health at 21, when we go back and say what were they like at 5, they were indistinguishable, and there wasn't much of a difference. So no, when we see the very young child and we ask, is that the way the child is going to turn out because the child has mental health problems? From our research, the answer is it's a very, very poor predictor. I'll add one other thing which qualifies that a little bit. The thing that turned out to be the best and most important predictor of how the child was going to turn out educationally, emotionally, and socially was evidence that the child early on was violent, aggressive, and delinquent. Where there was early evidence of that, there was more continuity and there was more reason to be concerned. But where children were anxious, where children were depressed, we looked at them to see if that continued, the evidence of continuity there was very, very poor. So on the whole, the message I think is a very positive one, which is that most of us are going to do a good job irrespective of how good or bad parents we are.
So do you think we worry too much about all this?
There's no question.
Giving our kids a bad double meaning here?
There's no question that I think we agonise about being good parents when most of the time it really doesn't matter what we do, the children are going to turn out reasonably well, irrespective.
Well, that's good news for us all, isn't it? Then we can all go home. Thank you. Eve, you've done a lot of work with families. You've seen them develop over the years. What's your take on that? Do you see a sort of a continuity of kids growing up?
It's interesting because this research definitely would oppose some of the ideas that of early attachment theory,
Yes.
and that really having the secure base of really an empathy between the mother and a child is what allows that child to explore with confidence. So bringing it all together. But I do think that there's a great deal of variation, and of course, the black box is always your peer group and the influence of your peer group. I've seen so many in my clinical work. As a social worker, I see a lot of kids who come in as a result of gang violence, and I see a lot of kids who come in as a result of gang violence who are not involved, and distinguishing the difference between those who were caught in the crossfire and those who are maybe caught up in a cycle of violence. You can often see through the parents, we were talking about this a bit at lunch, through the level of engagement when they come in the room. And when they come in the room, they should come in the room angry. You know, they should be very afraid, and this is a positive use of anger. But I think that helping a child develop is, in some ways, you do have to set pretty hard guidelines. And I guess not messing up too hard can fall into that. But I think those are very natural ways, a reaction of fear, a reaction of sadness when a child is really making big mistakes, essential.
Just want to have a little bit of a talk about self-harm, because there are a lot of statistics suggesting that that's on the rise, and that's something that I think the last generation didn't face perhaps as much as now. Why is that, Maggie?
I think it's this, the fact that our children, our girls particularly, the self-loathing is starting at preschool. Now we're seeing that with the heightened levels of anxiety and so forth. So by the time they hit teenage life, they've almost had a decade of anxiety. And I mean, they call it the new anorexia. And I found with my research that we kind of were very much on board with what's happening across the Western world, which is 1 girl in 10. And of course, that's not just cutting yourself, it's burning your hair, there's many, many ways that they self-harm. And it's interesting when you talk to the girls because they talk about it letting off the steam inside and that terrible sense of anxiety. But they also talk about it as totally normal. I remember talking to one girl and she said, oh yeah, I said, is there many girls around you at school who self-harm? Oh yeah. And she said, oh, my best friend does. She brings a little can of tuna to to school every day for lunch, and when she's had her lunch, she cuts her legs above her knees so that mum and dad don't know and the teachers don't know. And then she went to talk about something else, just purely as if it was like making a cup of tea. So for this generation, it's normal, and that's one of the concerning things I think with that very at-risk kind of culture we have now through popular culture. Is that it normalises behaviours that aren't. And when you say to girls, 20 years ago, girls didn't do this, they look at you as if you're talking Swahili. So that is something I think we do need to be concerned about.
We don't have a lot of time left, so I'd like to get onto some practical things that parents can do. I think we've covered a lot of things that society perhaps should be re-examining, such as advertising and the like. But what are some of the practical things that we as parents can do? I must admit, when I read your papers the other day, I was a little overwhelmed as a parent about all the things that we should and shouldn't do. And I felt a little guilty, and I thought, oh my God, we're not doing that, and we should be doing more of this and that. What are some of those practical things? Can we just have a toss around of some of those ideas?
I think actually it is actually about regaining your confidence as a parent, because I think what's happened with the marketing, it's been very clever to make parents not listen to their instincts, and it's all about kind of, oh, I better not say no because I won't look cool. And so going with your own instincts around things and creating a home culture that is lively and nurturing, and not getting into that whole thing of feeling that you have to buy love because you mightn't have enough time, and realising that you are the greatest resource your child can have. And even though they mightn't show it with all the attitude, they want mum and dad in their lives. And so knowing that your time together is the most precious thing, telling your stories so that they know where they've come from. Time out in nature, often quite simple things, are really the very nurturing things.
There's so much going on in the modern household, though, isn't there? And it's not just the parents sort of in and out of the house with work and other commitments. There are ageing parents to take care of as well, and the demands of that. The children themselves are much busier these days with their own commitments, both school and sporting and extracurricular. How can we balance those commitments with the ideal, which is I guess, what you've just outlined? Jake, did you want to pick up on that?
In contrast to some of my colleagues, my first reaction is I really don't think we should be worrying too much about what we're doing. The children have their own agenda, and the other thing that we notice is that as the children grow up, and I think increasingly they're in a connected world, connected electronically, connected socially, and we as parents become increasingly trivial.
Is that real connection? I'm sorry to cut you off, but is that a real connection? Once the children would have had church and social groups, now they have, computers and iPods. Is that a real social connection for them? Is that enough connectedness?
We don't know what that connection really means. I agree. It's a connection which, on the face of it, seems facile. To be connected electronically and in other ways. But it seems to be what children want and the priority that they have. And so by the time the children are starting to reach puberty, we're starting to see that the parents are really fading from the important role that they've had and the kind of relationships they've had. And increasingly, it's the world out there, and it's a very strange world out there. It's a world out there that I know little about, unfortunately, which is conducted on all sorts of media that I'm unfamiliar with. But it's a world that matters incredibly to them. And we increasingly matter little. And so I suppose I look at it and I think there isn't my view is there isn't an awful lot we can do. Other than, I mean, we can love
No,
them.
I can see Maggie thinking no. I think there's things we can do. So
Well, I don't think there is a lot. I mean, I think
Yeah.
we can love them and care for them and do things to give them a safe, secure environment. But having said that, they're increasingly defining their own lives in ways that we didn't find our lives. And there isn't a great deal we're going to be able to do about that, I think.
Maggie?
Look, I think our children are our children. They don't belong to the marketers. And I think we have to reclaim them so that they have that space to grow up in. We have to speak out about the pornography. We have to speak out about the billboards and things like that. At the same time as allowing our children to grow up in the 21st century, of course. And I think one of the things for parents, it's incredibly hard. It's incredibly hard to be a teacher today, to be a policeman, to be a healthcare giver. I think what we need is community again. We need to be supporting our parents. We need to be supporting our teachers so that we create this wonderful kind of nurture for our children to be 21st century kids, where we will all be enriched by that. And I'm totally convinced we can do it. It's the power of every single decision we make, from presents to billboards to, you know, the conversations around the kitchen table. Those things matter. They do matter.
Yep. Eve, how much do they matter?
I was just thinking, these are not things that need to be impaired by having two parents in the workforce. And I think one of the great findings of our book was it wasn't just the mother, it's the mother and the father together.
Yeah.
And that the partnership and developing a communication that you impart to your children. Of course, I had two parents, full-time workers the whole time, and I turned out quite okay, and I have a great relationship with them. I really think that this is a partnership and a project that can be intentionally achieved.
Yep. Russ, what do you think?
Yeah, I think, you know, look, everyone's very busy these days, and parents get caught up in the to-do list. Actually scheduling quality time with your kids and with your family where it is not watching television or distracting yourself, but there's that real mindful engagement which is at the center of attachment. And I think also what else we can do is kind of talk about our emotions and have our kids understand that fear and sadness and anxiety are normal, whereas very often when kids are feeling anxious, they're told, oh, don't be silly or grow up. Apparently there's this magical age where you don't feel anxious anymore. And I think one really good thing we can do as parents is allow our kids to be bored. Take away all the distractions. Give them some time just to be bored. And out of that comes creativity and use of your mind. You know, I think there's lots we can do. Yeah.
They hate that though, don't they? They hate being bored. I'm bored. What can I do?
Yeah, well,
Very
that's when we need to
frustrating.
manage our anxiety. You know,
That's
it's
right,
like,
yeah.
oh, I better give them a video. No, let them be bored.
Let them be bored. Good advice. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for this afternoon. We have got some great tips there. You know, we do need to stand up to the advertisers, I think, a lot more and have a go at that. But I am also reassured by Jake, saying that we all eventually turn out okay anyway, which is excellent news. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much to our panellists this afternoon. Thank you.